Lucille Ricksen's name is little known today, but there was a time when Hollywood was sure it had a star in the making on its hands. Ricksen might have become as internationally famous as Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, or Katharine Hepburn had she lived to adulthood. On the surface, her story looks like a simple tragedy from a bygone and more dangerous age. But I'm lifting the lid on the life and death of Lucille Ricksen in this episode. What's underneath it all is a far darker and far more sinister story that still has implications today. Before we travel back in time to the Golden Age, let me know in the comments where you're reading from. Dim the lights, pour yourself a classic drink, and join us as we uncover Hollywood's best-kept secrets to understand the ghost that Lucille Ricksen would become. We must first look for the girl she never truly had the chance to be. Her story begins not under the palm trees of California, but in the gritty, industrial sprawl of Chicago, Illinois. It was here, on August 22nd, that Ingeborg Myrtle Elizabeth Erickson was born. While her birth date is recorded, the year remains a subject of calculated ambiguity, a hallmark of a life that would soon be edited to fit the whims of producers. Publicity materials would later claim she was born in 1906, but the cold, hard ink of her death certificate and the 1910 U.S. Census suggest she was likely born as late as 1910. This discrepancy of 4 years is not merely a clerical error. It was the first layer of the mask that would eventually suffocate her. Lucille was born into the home of Danish immigrants, Sauron Samuel Eriksson and Ingeborg Nielsen, who had come to America in the late 1800s seeking a better life. But the American dream in the early 20th century was often a nightmare of labor and struggle. For the Erickson family, survival was the primary directive. In this harsh environment, a child's beauty was not just a genetic gift, it was a commodity. Lucille possessed Nordic golden curls and an ethereal quality that made her stand out instantly. To her mother, Ingeborg, these curls were not just beautiful, they were currency. Long before she ever stepped onto a movie set, Lucille was put to work. Her career didn't start with a passion for the arts. It started in the cradle. She began working as a model when she was still a baby. One can only imagine the psychological toll on an infant. Constantly prodded, posed, and managed by adults who viewed her compliance as a job requirement. The work was demanding, poorly paid, and required a child who was unnaturally well-behaved. In these early years, we see the formation of the primal wound. Lucille learned that love and approval were conditional, contingent on her ability to sit still, to smile on command, and to earn money to supplement the family's income. The safety standards of the time were practically non-existent. Professional child modeling was exhausting, exposing frail bodies to heavy equipment, dangerously hot lighting, and the constant, looming threat of studio fires. Yet, Lucille and her older brother Marshall were pushed forward because, as history tells us, they had the temperament for the work. But was it temperament, or was it a survival instinct drilled into them by a mother who saw no other option at the age of 4? The little girl named Ingeborg was erased, and Lucille Ricksen was created. It was a more Americanized, marketable name for a product that was ready for mass consumption. By 1915, the movie industry was exploding, not just in the nascent hills of Hollywood, but in established hubs like Chicago. Ingeborg Erickson, driven by a potent mix of desperation and ambition, brought her 5-year-old daughter to the gates of S&A Studios on Argyle Street. She knew her daughter had the it factor needed to become a star, and in her mind, the sooner the exploitation began, the better. Lucille later recalled her first terrifying encounter with the studio system in a way that sounds almost like a fable from the Brothers Grimm. "A man my mother talked to picked me up and put me on a table," she wrote. "He pulled my curls and asked if he could have one." Even at 5, Lucille had the spirit to shake her head no. The man's response was chilling in its foreshadowing. "Well, I'll be nicer to you than that. I'm going to give you a part." That role as a Cupid was the beginning of the end of her childhood. Over the next 3 years, she worked steadily at SNA and Selig Polyscope, appearing in films like The Millionaire Baby. But as Lucille's star began to flicker, the foundation of her home life crumbled. By 1918, when Lucille was just 8 years old, the Ricksen family was in turmoil. The Chicago film industry was in decline, and so was the marriage of Samuel and Ingeborg. The dynamic between Lucille's parents reveals the tragedy's true antagonist. Samuel Ricksen, the father, did not share his wife's ferocious drive to monetize their children. He was a salesman, perhaps content with a simpler life. But Ingeborg had tasted the potential for wealth. She no longer saw her children's work as a way to supplement income. She viewed them as the primary source of it. In her eyes, Lucille had the potential to make them fabulously rich. This fundamental disagreement shattered the family. Ingeborg divorced Samuel, effectively removing the one barrier between Lucille and total exploitation, with the father out of the picture. The path was clear. Around 1919, a call came from the West. A siren song from another Samuel Goldwyn. Goldwyn told Ingeborg to abandon the dying embers of the Chicago film scene and come to where the real fire was burning Hollywood. For Ingeborg, this wasn't just a move, it was a business expansion. She packed up Lucille and Marshall and headed to Los Angeles, leaving behind the last remnants of a normal life. They arrived in a town that was, much like Lucille, growing too fast for its own good. A theater mogul named Sid Grauman, often referred to as Roth-Apfel in early records, met with the family and assured Ingeborg that Lucille had the charm to succeed, with the backing of powerful men like Goldwyn and Grauman. Ingeborg knew she was standing on the precipice of the big time. But as they settled into this new life, no one stopped to ask the little girl with the golden curls what she wanted. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the tragedy of Lucille Ricksen was about to begin in earnest. By 1920, the machinery of Hollywood had fully embraced the Ricksen family, or rather, the commodity they provided. Samuel Goldwyn, a man with an eye for talent and a blind eye for ethics, signed Lucille to play the sweetheart of Johnny Jones in the highly popular Edgar comedy series, based on the stories by Booth Tarkington, then considered America's greatest living novelist. These films were a cultural phenomenon. For a brief moment, 10-year-old Lucille became the apple of the audience's eye, portraying the character of Alice Littlefield with a natural charm that captivated millions. But behind the innocent laughter of the Edgar series, a disturbing fabrication was taking place. The studio wasn't interested in marketing a talented 10-year-old. They wanted a starlet. Publicity materials began to aggressively adjust her age, adding 3 to 4 years to her profile to make her appear older, more mature, and essentially, more marketable. While she was playing a child on screen, the industry was already plotting to steal her childhood off screen. The work was relentless. In 1920 alone, Lucille filmed 8 Edgar movies. While other children were learning arithmetic or playing in the streets, Lucille was clocking adult hours in a high-pressure environment. Financially, the gamble was paying off for her mother, Ingeborg. The family moved into a plush apartment on Washington Boulevard in Culver City, a physical symbol of the wealth generated by Lucille's exhaustion. Despite the grueling schedule, there were moments when the real child peeked through the cracks of the manufactured persona. One particular anecdote from the Goldwyn lot highlights the heartbreaking duality of her existence. One afternoon, while exploring the wardrobe department, Lucille found a pair of silver slippers with French heels, delighted that they fit her small feet. She completed the fantasy with silver stockings and a blue silk dress, even convincing the studio hairdresser to pin up her famous golden curls. Transformed into a miniature version of the movie divas she worked alongside, she strutted around the lot. When asked if anyone had seen Lucille Ricksen, the crew didn't recognize her, telling the disguised girl that Lucille had gone home hours ago. She later wrote in her journal, "I nearly died laughing. I wish I could have a day like that every day." It is a poignant, almost tragic admission. For Lucille, playing dress-up as an adult was a game. a rare moment of fun. She didn't realize that this game was about to become her permanent reality, and the silver slippers would soon turn into shackles as puberty began to set in. Ingeborg and the studio executives made a decision that borders on criminal by today's standards. They decided to skip Lucille's adolescence entirely. At an age when she should have been in secondary school, she was thrust into roles that demanded a more mature image than her age. Ingeborg, her mother, driven by a desire to improve their economic situation, allowed photographers to capture her daughter in artistic poses while she was still very young. These images, though called art, were ultimately for financial gain. The major turning point came in 1923 with the film The Rendezvous, marking a shift in her career when she was given the lead role. Producer Marshall Nealon was looking for a lead actress, and the role was demanding a Russian princess exiled to Siberia, forced into a marriage with a cruel governor, who eventually seals her husband inside a tomb. It was a heavy, dark, and emotionally complex role suitable for a seasoned woman. Nealon cast Lucille Ricksen. She was just 13 years old, to justify casting a child in such a heavy role. The studio press machine went into overdrive, telling the media she was 16. This lie earned her the title of the youngest leading lady in the movies. The press marveled at her uncanny maturity, describing her as having been born under the shadow of a Lillian Gish complex. One reporter noted, "It makes you sorry, and it makes you glad." They sensed the tragedy, but they bought the ticket anyway. By 1924, Lucille Ricksen was everywhere. She was named one of the Wampa's baby stars, a prestigious honor shared that year with future legend Clara Bow. Director Albert Doris praised her as a finished actress, yet a mere child, predicting a career so full of opportunities that a steam shovel will be required to keep her pathway clear. On the surface, she had it all. She was starring in hits like The Painted Lady and The Hillbilly. She appeared in 10 feature films in just over 7 months. But this steam shovel of success was digging her grave. The gap between the smiling, sophisticated girl on the magazine covers and the overworked, exhausted child in the Culver City apartment was widening. The mask was perfect, but the person wearing it was beginning to suffocate. By the mid-1920s, Hollywood was not just a place, it was a hungry beast, and it demanded to be fed. Lucille Ricksen was the main course. The studio system, run by moguls who viewed actors as chattel, had completely taken over her life in a staggering display of exploitation. Lucille appeared in 10 feature films in just over 7 months during 1924. This schedule would have broken a seasoned adult veteran for a 14-year-old girl still developing physically and emotionally. It was a death sentence. The youngest leading lady was trapped in a golden cage, while the press lauded her boundless energy. The reality was a regimen of pills, adrenaline, and fear. She was dragged from set to set, barely finishing a scene in The Hillbilly before being thrust into The Painted Lady. There were no labor laws to protect her, no child advocates to step in. Her guardians, the studio executives and her own mother, were the very ones cracking the whip. The media, too, played a sinister role. They consumed the lie of her maturity and demanded more. They scrutinized her love life, her fashion, and her adult choices, willfully ignoring the fact that the subject of their gossip was a child who still played with dolls in secret. The industry stripped away her privacy, her sleep, and her sanity, all while the cameras kept rolling. Perhaps the most disturbing element of Lucille's conflict was her relationship with the adults around her, specifically the men. She was surrounded by older actors who treated her as a peer and a romantic prospect, rather than a child. Among them was Sidney Chaplin. The older half-brother of Charlie Chaplin, Lucille had worked with Sidney in The Rendezvous and later in The Galloping Fish. Rumors began to swirl through the whisper networks of Hollywood, rumors that were as persistent as they were dark. The Billboard even published a piece suggesting the two had secretly married in the fall of 1923, while no marriage certificate has ever surfaced, and her family today dismisses the claim. The smoke suggests a fire. Sidney Chaplin had a notorious reputation, known for his preference for very young girls. a trait that would later end his career after an assault accusation by actress Molly Wright. His proximity to Lucille raises chilling questions. Was Lucille merely a co-star? Or was she being groomed in plain sight in the lawless landscape of early Hollywood, where powerful men took what they wanted? The idea of a 14-year-old girl being preyed upon by a man in his late 30s is not just a theory. It is a terrifying probability. The love she portrayed on screen with men twice her age was bleeding into her real life, confusing her sense of self and boundaries. Behind the velvet ropes and the premiere parties, Lucille was disintegrating. She was known to be high-strung and enthusiastic, code words often used to describe someone on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Isolated from her peers, she had no one to confide in. Her friends were the people who employed her or the men who courted her. She tried to cope by throwing herself into the work, adopting the persona of the professional. She told interviewers, "I'm often asked, do I find my work hard? No, indeed. I can be no happier than when I'm working." It was a rehearsed line, a script fed to her by a mother desperate to keep the money train moving. But the body keeps the score, the exhaustion, the malnutrition from staying camera thin, and the psychological weight of living a lie began to manifest physically. There were darker whispers, too. Theories that have persisted for a century suggest that Lucille's sudden decline wasn't just exhaustion, reminiscent of the Virginia Rappy scandal. Some historians and Hollywood insiders speculated that a botched abortion, perhaps the result of her liaisons with powerful industry figures, led to an infection that her weakened body could not fight. While unproven, the theory aligns with the sudden, secretive nature of her collapse and the fierce protectiveness of her mother, who would have gone to any lengths to hide such a shameful crime. The breaking point arrived in late 1924 on the set of The Galloping Fish. It was a comedy, a Keystone-type film designed to make audiences laugh until they cried. But there was no laughter for Lucille. In the middle of a scene, the youngest leading lady simply folded. She collapsed, her body finally rejecting the impossible demands placed upon it. Ingeborg, terrified not just for her daughter's health but for the potential scandal, immediately pulled her from the public eye. Lucille was confined to her bed in their apartment on North Gardner Avenue. The studio PR machine went into damage control mode. Nervous breakdown. They claimed, that's all. Ingeborg released a statement saying Lucille just needed rest. Lots of it. But the doctors knew better. Dr. J.F. McKittrick, who treated her, later admitted the truth. She crowded too much work into too short a time. The result is that she has had a complete physical and nervous collapse, so complete that she has not rallied from it. The initial diagnosis was tuberculosis, a common killer of the era. But the speed of her decline suggested something more acute, something systemic. As 1925 began, the Ricksen apartment became a house of death. The money was drying up. Her brother Marshall had to quit high school to find menial work to support the family. Ingeborg, consumed by guilt and terror, kept a round-the-clock vigil at her daughter's bedside. She watched the life drain out of the golden child she had pushed too hard. Then came the final, grotesque twist of the knife. The stress of watching her daughter die was too much for Ingeborg's own heart. On a morning in February 1925, Ingeborg, who had been sleeping on a sofa near Lucille's bed, thought she heard her daughter call out. She rushed to the bedside, perhaps to offer water or a comforting word. As she leaned over to tuck Lucille in, a massive heart attack struck her, in a scene that seems too horrific to be real. Ingeborg collapsed. She fell directly onto her daughter's frail, bedridden body. Her final words, gasped out as she lay dying on top of the child she had exploited, were, "Take care of yourself, dear Marshall." Hearing Lucille's screams, rushed into the room to pull his dead mother off his dying sister. But the damage was done. Lucille, already weak, was shattered. She had been crushed, literally and metaphorically, by the weight of her mother's ambition. After the funeral, Lucille turned her face to the wall, buried her head in her pillow, and slipped into a coma. She had nothing left to live for. The machine had won, After the horrific death of her mother, Lucille Ricksen was no longer just a star. She was a ghost, haunting her own life. The trauma of Ingeborg collapsing and dying directly on top of her seemed to sever the last thread holding Lucille to this world. She buried her face in her pillow, let out a sob, and slipped into a coma. A state that seemed less like a medical condition, and more like a refusal to participate in a reality that had been so cruel to her. The apartment on North Gardner Avenue, once a bustling hub of ambition, fell into a suffocating silence. Lucille was surrounded by the debris of her career, but she was profoundly alone, while the Hollywood community made gestures of support. Paul Byrne covered nursing costs, and actress Lois Wilson spent hours at her bedside. Lucille was painfully aware of her stolen youth. In a moment of heartbreaking clarity, she confessed to Wilson, "I've supported my family with my acting since I was 4 years old." It was a final admission of the burden she had carried. A child laborer realizing the weight of the yoke only as she was about to be released from it. The end came on a date that superstitious Hollywood would never forget. Friday, March 13th, 1925. Lucille was just 14 years old. Even in her final moments, the pleaser in her, the part trained to smile for the cameras, tried to comfort those around her, confined to her bed, surrounded by her brother, her estranged father, and Lois Wilson. She tried to maintain the facade of the Sunshine Girl. She reportedly told her nurse, "I've known for the last 2 days that I'm going fast, and somehow I'm not afraid." Looking at the faces of the mourners, she whispered, "This is my sunshine room. I love the sunshine so much. Please, won't you all be so happy? I know I will be well soon." These were the words of a child who had been trained to ensure the happiness of others at the expense of her own. Moments later, the youngest leading lady in Hollywood history took her final breath, escaping the industry that had consumed her. The tragedy of Lucille Ricksen did not end with her death. It merely shifted focus to the spoils of her labor. 2 days after her passing, a service was held at the little church around the corner, attended by industry figures like Rupert Hughes and Paul Byrne. Her ashes were placed in a bronze urn alongside her mother's at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, uniting the victim and the architect of her demise in eternity. But the silence of the grave was quickly broken by the noise of greed. It was revealed that Lucille had left behind a $50,000 life insurance policy, a fortune in 1925. Her father, Soren Samuel Eriksson, who had been largely absent during her rise in exploitation, suddenly reappeared as the sole beneficiary. While family members claimed Lucille intended the money for her brother Marshall's education, the optics were damning. A bitter legal battle ensued over the guardianship of Marshall, pitting the father against Lucille's industry friends, Rupert Hughes and Conrad Nagel. The court eventually reached a compromise, giving the father control of the money while naming Hughes and Nagel as guardians of the boy. Marshall would go on to survive, becoming a successful lawyer, but he rarely spoke of the sister who had died to build the foundation of his life. Lucille Ricksen was gone, her life converted into cash, and a cautionary tale that Hollywood would quickly choose to forget. Looking back at the brief, incandescent life of Lucille Ricksen, we are left with a haunting question. What did we actually see? We saw a youngest leading lady who could command a scene with the gravitas of a woman 3 times her age. We saw a wampus baby star who stood shoulder to shoulder with Clara Bow. But these were just flickering lights on a screen. The reality was much darker. Lucille was, as journalist Albert Doris described in 1924, the strangest conglomeration of contradictions, the reincarnation of the Sphinx. She was an unsolvable riddle, a child forced to be an adult, a breadwinner treated like a doll, a public icon who died in private agony. The audience was fascinated by her ability to gobble up life in huge mouthfuls, never realizing that she was choking on it. We are drawn to her story today not just because of the tragedy, but because it exposes the terrifying cost of our entertainment. Lucille exchanged her childhood, her health, and ultimately her life for a few years of applause and a bronze urn in a columbarium. It is easy to blame a nervous breakdown or a weak constitution for her death, but the autopsy of her career reveals the true killers. Lucille Ricksen didn't just die of tuberculosis or exhaustion. She was murdered by a system that viewed children as disposable fuel for the cinematic engine. Her mother, Ingeborg, pushed her daughter deeper into Hollywood in the hope of wealth. Her father, Samuel, only returned when he had insurance money to claim. Film studio executives like Samuel Goldwyn and director Marshall Nealon exploited her talent to the fullest, giving a young girl roles filled with complex emotions and immense psychological pressure. Meanwhile, public opinion and the media only began to question issues related to child protection after her death. Lucille Ricksen is considered a prime example of the tragedy faced by child stars in early Hollywood. Her story is the prologue to the lives of Judy Garland, Corey Haim, and countless modern influencers exploited by momagers. The technology has changed, but the ruthlessness remains the same. As one commentator noted at the time, when it comes to exploitation, evil is more than sin. Hollywood learned nothing from Lucille Ricksen except how to hide the bodies better. Yet, we must not remember Lucille Ricksen solely as a victim. To do so would be to strip her of the agency she fought so hard to find in her performances. She was a talent of generous maturity who, even while dying, tried to bring sunshine to those around her. She was a professional who supported her entire family from the age of 4. Today, her name is often obscured by false information, even appearing with incorrect dates in modern films like The Artist. But her legacy endures in the silence of the silent films she left behind. She stands as a reminder that behind every glimmering star on the Walk of Fame, there is a human heart that beats, breaks, and sometimes stops too soon. So, the next time you see a child star dazzle you on screen with wisdom beyond their years, remember the girl with the silver slippers who wished she could play dress-up just for fun. Remember Lucille. That's all for this episode. A sad tale this time, but one we can all learn something from. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider liking, sharing the video with a friend, and most important of all, subscribing if you haven't already.